So let's get started. This talk is about modularity in biological systems, and it comes at the end of a week-long workshop. Some of you have been part of this workshop, others have not. We've just crowded your space while we were here. What I want to do is, first of all, tell you a little bit about what this workshop was about. And here's what's on the NITMB website to describe the goal of this workshop. It focuses on modularity. Most people accept the fact that, yes, biological systems are modular. They're somehow composed of pieces that are coherent or are supposed to carry out a particular function, although that's contentious by itself. And it generally is poorly defined what a module is, right? The idea is sort of, you know it when you see it. And what we've seen here is we've had a group of very diverse participants. No, I didn't want to go there. We had a group of very diverse participants here that come from various fields in biology, from systems biology, from neuroscience, from developmental biology, evolution, synthetic biology. In all of those fields, the modularity concept is used. What people understand by a module is vastly different across fields. So that's what this workshop focused on. As I said here, it comes in many different fields. It's been around for a long time. It essentially came about right when complex systems theory was invented in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Modularity is a concept generally, not just in the life sciences. As I said, what the different fields have in common is that definitions differ, measures differ, and none of them are precise to sort of operationalize them in the sense that, ultimately we need to automate a lot of things. For example, decomposition of large models into smaller pieces that you can analyze, or building large models from smaller pieces. And so what we will need is a much more formalized, precise notion that might differ by context, it might differ by field, but it needs to be formalized. And so some of the questions that we grappled with over the course of the week: what are commonalities across the different fields? And can one formalize it in a way that encompasses all the different definitions in the different fields as a general notion of modularity? So let me go back. I'm sort of a person who likes history, and so I like history to get me to origins of things. And so what I did is I went back to the 1950s and 60s when systems theory was introduced into biology, and when people started to talk about biological systems. One of the key features of complex systems in general and biological systems in particular is this notion of self-organization, which, if you ask people, it's one of those things, again, that you know it when you see it. There is no definition of self-organization. And so self-organization is a particular case of organization. So what is an organization of a system? So let's leave off the adjective complex, because there is really no definition of what a complex system is. So let's take a system. And I went back to looking at some of the papers by Ross Ashby, one of the pioneers of this field. And he has a paper, a very nice paper, which I urge you to look at, called Principles of the Self-Organizing System. And so he defines organization. And it's a very interesting way to do this. So for him, a system is a set. It's a set of states of that system. and you have a function that takes a state and transforms it into another state. Okay. So very, very general. And for him, an organization is a decomposition of this set of states S into a product of subsets, which he calls the parts. So a finite number of parts that he puts together. And in modern language, what he does is he imposes a graph structure on these parts by saying I have a directed edge from part Ti to part Tj if the function, if the operation of f on Tj in some way depends on Ti. And one can define this in a number of different ways. So, he mentions different things. You could do this statistically using Fisher's variance theory. One could look at it if you have a functional description of f, you could actually look at the rules that f obeys and check whether that happens. You could vary Ti all across the elements in Ti and see whether the value of f on Tj differs. A number of ways in which you can do this. And what he calls an organization is then this directed graph. That's the organization that, that's the definition he gives of an organization. So very, very general. There's no conditions on what these T's should satisfy or anything of this sort. So, and of course, modularity, one can consider, at least for some definitions, a special case of organization. You take a system, you divide it up into parts. There are some relationships between these parts, and one can encode this in a similar way. And I'll show you an example of that in a bit. So he makes a number of interesting observations. He says conditionality is the core of the concept of organization. And by conditionality, he refers precisely to this dependence between the parts. Some parts are conditional on other parts. That is his notion. And this is, in my mind, the most interesting observation that he makes. And that says the theory of organization is concerned with properties that are not intrinsic to the system, but rather it is a way for the observer to interact with the system. So it is an organizational principle that we impose on the system in order to understand it better, in order to analyze it, but it does not need to be intrinsic to the system itself. So potentially, if you have a theory of modularity, if you know how to define this thing, take a particular biological system and break it up into pieces, those pieces might have really nothing to do with biological features. It could be something completely different that helps you to understand the system better. And as he says, an organization is intrinsically neither good nor bad. What is meant by good must be defined by whoever wants to study this organization. Okay, so that one can, of course, translate into saying, applied to modularity, modularity is in the eye of the beholder, as we've heard several times. But I think it's, in a less flippant way, it basically says, if this organization does something for you, either it helps you control the system better, it helps you to understand it better, it helps you to build it better, then it's a good organization. Otherwise, in your particular case, it is not. And he makes he gives some examples. For example, if you take a human body, right, it is organized according to organs. And that works pretty well for many reasons. But he says, there is a reason why slime molds don't have organs. Because for slime molds, that's a really bad organization. And he explains why. So that gets to the point where, and that we've brought up many times over the course of the week, that modules might be context dependent. And we've seen an example for, say, that Danny Bassett gave us in neuroscience, that the modular organization of the brain changes as you learn new things. And generally that's sort of colloquially referred to as sort of the brain rewires itself as it does different tasks. So to me, this is a really good way to think about modularity. If you have a definition of modularity, you need to be able to say why that is a good one. What does it do for you? Just the question itself is based on what I've seen in the literature is not always considered, right? Especially if you have sort of graph theoretic approaches, you have a graph breakup into sort of communities, and it's not always made clear what ultimately the gain in insight is from such a decomposition. So that's Ashby's point of view. And what I want to show you next is to make this concrete. And before I do this, let me point you to a paper. It's a perspective paper that came out of a working group we've been running that meets twice a month on modularity. And this is a perspective paper that came out of that group, which we're about to submit. We submitted it earlier to the archive, but the archive rejected it. So it's the first time that I had a paper rejected by the archive, and of course you cannot go any lower. And I was rejected, of course, because it was had not sufficiently novel results in it. So in any case, so I cannot just give you a link. If you're interested in looking at it, I can send you a copy, and I will talk about several things that are in this paper now. Just for those of you who are really not familiar with this topic, what is commonly considered modularity. Here's an example that focuses on sort of a functional definition of modularity. Here you have a number of different genes that are networked together. The circles essentially cluster together genes based on the function each of these modules carries out. And the whole thing together tells you something about metastasis signature in prostate cancer. So here's an example of one. Another example would be, this is a protein-protein interaction map in E. coli. So this would be made by sort of correlating expression levels. And of course, the lit up clusters in this matrix, they would correspond to what in this context would be called modules. And a common way of doing this is, for example, to cluster transcriptomics data in this way. So one of the things we've done in this year-long working group is we've derived several criteria that we thought could be part of what a module would be. And there is a debate we've had, I think, for part of this week. Should you define a module by saying specifically, this is a subsystem of your system that we call a module, and then you derive properties from it, or you say a module is something that satisfies these particular characteristics, and whatever satisfies those characteristics, we will consider a module. So the different criteria are, the first one is obviously we need some precise definition in given different contexts. And so you have different definitions. They could be structural, they could be functional. The first example I showed you of the gene network related to cancer, that was a structural one, that was a functional one, and actually the second one I gave is also a functional one, but it could be structural. You could divide clusters of genes, for example, by co-expression. So if you read about modularity and its role in complex systems, then what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to affect dynamics. It's supposed to make dynamics more stable. It's supposed to make the system more robust. And so one can call this dynamics if you're thinking of systems biology, or one could call it function. But if you give a structural definition of modularity, it needs to tell you something about function or about dynamics. Conversely, if you have a functional definition, it needs to somehow be related to structural features of the system. Criterion 3, following Ashby, should be, if you have a notion, then what does it do for you? Right? Is it actually useful? And criterion 4, I'm a mathematician. I would like to have a mathematical framework within which this can be precisely formulated. And as I said a little bit ago, if you want to automate a lot of these things, then you need to have a formal language within which you specify this so that you ultimately can turn it into software and put it on a computer. Okay. So what I want to do now is give you an example of this that we've worked on, and this example came about from my point of view. What I've worked on is mathematical systems biology. I think of biology as dynamic. We need to represent it as dynamic, as a dynamical system. And so that means you choose your favorite dynamic type of model. Could be differential equations, could be Boolean networks, could be agent-based models, could be stochastic processes, could be Petri nets, whatever works best in your particular context. That's what you choose. And so the premise was that if modularity is a thing, then it should be reflected in how we model systems. It should be reflected in the models that we use. If it doesn't, then either it's not a thing, or our models are inappropriate to capture that important characteristic. So I want to show you an example of this. I have long worked in Boolean network models. So these are discrete models that give you a qualitative view of a system. They're quite commonly used, for example, to capture gene regulation and other kinds of processes. And they are very, they're relatively easy to understand for a non-modeler, and they're relatively easy to manipulate. So we focused on that. And the idea was, can we find decompositions in the structure of the model that one could call modular? And if so, does it translate into information about the dynamics? So again, coming from theoretical math, there are lots and lots of decompositions of this sort in mathematics, whether it's topology, geometry, algebra. You take some object and some type of object. So in my case, what I was looking at is the collection of finite groups. Right? So those are sets with a certain operation that's similar to addition of numbers. And there's a beautiful theorem that says every finite group can be uniquely decomposed into some kind of composition of what are called simple groups. So simple groups are, simple in some respect to groups. And then if I know what all the simple groups look like, I know exactly what all the groups look like. And mathematics loves classification. So that's a kind of classification. And that was sort of the paradigm that initially inspired me to do what we did. So what we looked for is the decomposition of Boolean networks. Any Boolean network can be decomposed into blah, 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 such that, in our case, what we were looking for is such that there is a similar decomposition of the dynamics of the Boolean network. In other words, can I take the limit cycles or fixed points of a Boolean network and somehow write them in terms of the limit cycles of what we would call the modules. That was what we were after. Now, if you think about dynamics, one of the key features that drives dynamics is feedback loops. And so feedback loops, if you think about the dependency structure of the variables in your model, they correspond to closed loops among the variables. And so that's what our definition was. In this paper that was published a few years ago, if I have a Boolean network, so here's an example of a Boolean network. What you see is there are two pieces to it. The structure is on the left side. So in this case, it has three variables. There could be three genes that in this case are either off or on. They have only two states. If I wanted to, I could make it have 3 states or 4 states. And they're used quite commonly because if you listen to how biologists oftentimes describe their work, is they will say, well, this gene is upregulated twofold, or this gene is upregulated, the other one is downregulated. It's very qualitative. This captures this qualitative feature. If you really need to know that it is expressed 2.37-fold, then this is the wrong type of model for you. So what's on the left side here is I will call a structure, and what you see on the right side is the dynamics, right? So the set of all states of this will be all triples of binary numbers. So up there, 110 says variable x1 is in state 1, variable x2 is in state 1, and variable x3 is in state 0. And so here you have altogether, you have 8 possible states. It's 2 to the third. And this Boolean network comes with logic functions on each of the nodes that tell you how the node integrates the different inputs. And the arrows on the left side show you which variables give input to which other variables. So if you look at feedback loops in here, then you would see, for example, this here is a feedback loop from x2 to x3 and back. This would be a feedback loop. This big one would be a feedback loop. This one would be, for example. So here we have, I think, 3 of them altogether. So our hypothesis was that the modules of this Boolean network would be all the subsets of this graph, all the subgraphs of this graph that are strongly connected in the sense that between every 2 nodes in this subset, you have a directed path. Another way to look at it is if a module contains part of a feedback loop, it contains all of the feedback loop. So you divide this up with respect to a feature, a structural feature that plays a big role in the dynamics. Okay, so that's the definition of module. So in this case, you actually would just get one module because everything is connected to everything in a directed path. So generally what you would get if you take a Boolean network and you take its dependency graph and you divide it up into strongly connected components, what you will get is you can represent this as a partially ordered set. So in this case, each of these nodes represents a strongly connected component in this dependency graph. And if you think about it, you can have connections from one strongly connected component to another one, but you cannot have connections in both directions because otherwise they wouldn't be maximal. They would coalesce into one strongly connected component. So you represent this as a partially ordered set where the things upstairs are the upstream components and they come down to downstream components. So in this case, this node will have connections to, so this strongly connected component will have connections to this one, this one, this one, and so on. So one way you can think about this graph is you take all the strongly connected components and you collapse them to one node. So if you think of it, a strongly connected component or a module as a functional unit, then if you just turn that functional unit into a black box, this is what describes for you the dynamic structure of this Boolean network. And I will get back to this in a little bit. To me, understanding the topology of this partially ordered set or a directed acyclic graph, whichever you want to consider it, I think is a very important determinant of what the biology or what the dynamics of the whole system is. And that's not well understood. So then what I'm going to show you here is how I take two strongly connected networks, F and G, and I can glue them together to make a bigger one. Alternatively, you can go the other way. Here's a Boolean network, its dependency graph. I have two strongly connected components in this. How are they made up? By gluing together networks that are smaller. So remember I told you my motivation is I can build every group by gluing together simple subgroups, and this will essentially result in a theorem that says every Boolean network can be glued together in specified ways from subnetworks that are strongly connected. And the way this works is here I have two of these, and I have information about how to glue them together. So this is information about how F influences nodes in G. So in this case, we have three of those. We have an influence here, we have an influence here, and we have an influence here. And so this is the glue that glues this to this. We've written this as in analogy to language in group theory as a semi-direct product, right? If there were no connections here, then this would just be the product of these two things, which is two independent pieces. They don't interact. So I don't need to consider them together. I can analyze them separately, right? But generally, there are connections here, and that's when I read some definitions of modularity that says, well, you have subsystems that are independent of each other. Technically, that can't be correct, because otherwise they're just separate systems that I happen to consider side by side. And then I don't need to worry about any connectivity between them. So this is the basic operation that I have to glue things like this together. And so here's a theorem that we have in this paper that I showed you that says that if I have a network and I can decompose it in the way that I just showed you, then what I get is that the limit cycles of the bigger system are a gluing of the limit cycles of the two smaller systems. So in other words, I analyze the dynamics of these two pieces separately, and I get the limit cycles of the two pieces. And every limit cycle of the big system is sort of a pairing of two, one in each piece, except it comes sort of with a twist. And the twist is implemented by these gluing instructions. So what it says is if I know the dynamics of the modules, I can completely reconstruct the dynamics of the whole system. So I'm showing you here a figure we have in the paper. So this is an analysis that we did on a published collection of Boolean networks, about 100 and some. And we analyzed this modular decomposition. And what you see here is this partially ordered set that I showed you before. Right? So each of these nodes here corresponds to a strongly connected component, and the arrows are dependency relations. And what you can see is that you get sort of vastly different topology in the different ones, and that would persist if you look at all 100 some. So again, we've not made an analysis of what the topology tells you about the dynamics. So you see some features here, like here you have, if you like, sort of what's called typically a bow tie structure. You have a big component that a lot of stuff feeds into, and that controls a lot of stuff downstream. Or you have a much more diffuse dependency structure. So understanding what these different partially ordered sets, what their topology tells you about the dynamics, I think is a really interesting project. So why would this be a good thing to do? What do strongly connected components have to do with biology? I cannot answer this question, but one thing that I can answer is one of the things you do want to do is you want to control biological systems. In this case, this is a network that is an intra and intercellular network related to, I think it's what kind of cancer is it again, David?
Pancreatic cancer.
Pancreatic cancer. And so here the idea is, how can you control this system and move the cell from being proliferative to being apoptotic? And the control mechanism is you knock out a gene. So you have a drug that maybe makes a protein ineffective that this gene produces. And so what this theorem shows is that if you have a modular structure and you want to control that whole system, then you can control only individual modules, and you can glue that control together to a control of the entire system. So that in principle makes things much, much more simple. And here is an example of this network. It's a published network that its modular structure is you have 3 modules that are aligned in a hierarchical way. And you can identify different controls here. It turns out that if you can control these 2, this one is already taken care of. So it's much, much simpler. So at least from the point of view of functionality, this is a useful thing. And so if, for example, this turns out to have nothing to do with biology, but it actually helps you to control, then according to Ashby, that's a good organization. And I would agree. So there's that. Now, the paper we did was a lot of hard work. It was really sort of, you roll up your sleeves and you really grub around in all these limit cycles and you kind of glue them together and all this. And we were fortunate to connect with Chris Kapulkin and his colleagues. And what resulted was a much more elegant, easy, and abstract way to approach this. There's a paper here that's under review, Categorical Foundations for discrete dynamical systems, in which the theorems that we derived are reproven, but they're reproven in a much broader context, that of discrete dynamical systems, which is basically the notion of Ashby. You have a set of states S, and you have a function from that set to itself. So what fits into that? Certainly Boolean networks can be described in this way, but also Petri nets, cellular automata, a number of other things can be described in this way. So for example, if somebody asks me, can I now do the same decomposition you did in this prior paper for Petri nets, before this paper, I would have said, yes, you just have to go through the same process that we did. Right now, I would say, absolutely it holds because it fits in this framework, and automatically you get that result for free. You get this decomposition, this translation of a modular decomposition of the system into a modular decomposition of the dynamics. You get that for free. So let me not give you the details of this. Chris did a valiant effort earlier this week in the describing how this might work, what a category might be. But let me just take one of the figures in there. What we need to do is we have the category of dynamical systems. So that's the totality of dynamical systems. And to make it a category, you need to also talk about mappings between dynamical systems. So that's a very technical thing that you need to define. These are basically functions that preserve some key structure of discrete dynamical systems. So that's the category. That's the category we're interested in. And you have a mapping, which technically is called a functor, to the category of state spaces. So for a discrete dynamical system, the state space will be like the state space of a Boolean network. It will be a directed graph, where you have the elements are the nodes of the graph are states, and you have a directed edge from one state to another one if that function sends this state to this state. So it's a directed graph, could be finite, could be infinite. That's your state space. And from that, you extract the attractors. So those are the limit cycles, fixed points. So you have a collection of those over here. And the theorem we proved for Boolean networks, which are a subset of these discrete dynamical systems, is that if I decompose the Boolean network in terms of modules, then I get a similar decomposition all the way over here in the category of attractors. Now, what Chris and his colleagues did is they analyzed these two mappings and these categories. They turned out to be very nice. They have what a category theorist would say have rich structure. You can do all sorts of things in them. And these functors have very nice sort of general properties. And just from general theorems in category theory, you can conclude that if I have a decomposition like the one I showed you into modules, then automatically that decomposition ends up here. So anything that lives in here satisfies this property and gives you a decomposition here without ever sort of getting your hands dirty and grubbing around in limit cycles and things of that sort. And one of the things I think that one of the working groups did this week, as I understand it, they have expanded this to a much larger category of systems. You can include stochastic systems. You can include, I think, is Matt here? Somebody in that working group. What other things can we do?
Synchronous.
We can do asynchronous or Boolean networks. You can update them synchronously or asynchronously. The understanding is in biology, nothing is synchronous. So that expands it to that category and some additional features. In particular, it gets away from potentially using the wiring diagram of a system, because that is one of the problems with this theory of strongly connected components that I showed you, is that it depends very much on the wiring diagram. If you remove one edge, then potentially the strongly connected components in that dependency graph could change dramatically. And wiring diagrams are very ill-defined objects. People put certain things in, other things not. For some people, wiring diagrams, the nodes are all genes, and you put relationships between genes. Others put in phenotypes, relationships between genes and phenotypes, functions. So wiring diagrams are a challenge. And I think one of the problems in this whole field that one needs to focus on is make this wiring diagram, this dependency notion, much more precise. So from my point of view, this sort of setup is extremely promising in turning modularity into a very precisely formalized process. The way I think about it is that, as I said, this category is quite rich in the sense that it contains what a category theorist would call limits and colimits. So you can do various constructions in assembling things, taking things apart, and you can describe it as constructions in here that these functors then preserve. And so I can take any sort of organization, any sort of notion of modularity, and formalize it within that system. So I think it has the potential to be very broadly applicable to unify a number of different notions. And I understand the objections, and we've heard a number of them this week, that modularity does not cleanly fit into a theory like this. This is a very precise mathematical theory, and that is probably true. So we need notions of degrees of modularity. We need to have ways to measure it and represent those. But that's all sort of extensions of this. As Chris pointed out yesterday, the way mathematicians approach a bigger problem is they start with small examples. And they work out some small examples and then make these examples bigger and more complicated. And what we've done here is what I would think of as a small example, however powerful that already is. Okay. So much for that. So some of us spent this last week thinking about what's the bigger picture? Where does modularity fit into in the bigger picture, right? If you go to somebody who's been around for a while and you say, well, we really got to work on modularity, as Steve just told us earlier and expressed this very nicely, they will say, well, you really shouldn't worry about this. This thing has been worked on 20 years ago. It went nowhere. We don't know what it's good for, so forget about it. But I think I think we think in this group and maybe more broadly that it is a key feature that one needs to operationalize. It's a term Steve really likes. We need to operationalize it and automate a lot of the things we need to do, because problems in medicine, biotechnology, biomedicine are increasingly complicated. We need to build increasingly big models. We need to analyze increasingly complex models that cross scales. And in order to do that, and in order to automate that in some way, you have to impose an organizational structure on the representations you have of biological systems, and modularity is the natural one to use. And so we've basically, the hypothesis here is that we need to improve our ability to operate on biology for various applications. And we list here some current barriers. One of the problems is that at the current time, and maybe never, do we have laws of biology like we have laws of physics. And modularity, one could think of as a law of biology, but whatever you call it, it is a very useful organizational principle that one needs to implement, right? What we have in biology, aside from laws that we don't have, is we have a lot of biochemistry, which is fairly rigorous. We have a lot of pathway information. We have a lot of computational models. We have thousands of computational models that are published for different bits and pieces. They all need to be put together. They come at different scales. We need to put the scales together. And we thought a fair amount of how one might do this. So here's how modularity fits into all of this. It's a key feature of biological systems and needs to be incorporated into dynamical models in a natural way. And for that, we need to do all the things that I said we needed to do. So one of the goals we had here was to come up with a research program. So I don't think that we finished that. I don't think we got there. I think we have a list of different types of projects. The ones that I've listed here sort of naturally come out of the discussions we had. They're pretty high level. One can now drill down and make sort of grant proposal size projects out of them. Yeah, so it's sort of natural what these projects would be. First of all, find the right definitions. Collect biological evidence of which definitions actually correspond to biological features. Project 3 is an absolutely essential one in my mind. It's totally non-sexy, and it's, in my experience, very difficult to get funding for it, get anybody to pay you to develop standards, but it is absolutely totally important, right? For example, the FDA, if you submit a drug application that has a modeling component to it, the only standards that exist are for ordinary differential equations, but not for any other model type, like, for example, for agent-based models, which are used quite commonly. Of course, what is happening now relatively quickly is that applications with machine learning and AI models are being approved apparently without the need of any particular standards, how the models are formulated, which is a bit worrisome. And of course, the last one is you need some kind of mathematical formalism for this if you want to operationalize it. And what I've shown you in terms of these modular decompositions of Boolean networks, that is one example, I think, of a paradigm that fits a number of the criteria that we posed. It's by far not the only one, but it can be used as a paradigm. So with that, I want to end. And of course, like everybody who has been here, you should acknowledge the Institute for making this workshop possible. And everything I've said here has been influenced strongly by the people who spent the week here and this regular working group we have that meets twice a month on modularity in biological systems. If that is something you want to join, then please let me know. It's a Zoom meeting every other Tuesday at noon. With that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
I have a question. You mentioned talking about different scales, and a lot of these networks are all
Thanks.
You mentioned the need to find these networks in terms of different scales, and like the strongly coupled portions of a network are going to be dependent on like what scale you're looking at in terms of that coupling. So how have you been thinking about like connecting these modules when you're looking at really fine-grained structure versus really coarse-grained structure?
Yeah, so I think we need to look for multi-scale modules, right? There's no reason to believe that these modules restrict themselves to an individual scale when these scales are closely coupled. So that would be my Now, of course, multi-scale modeling is difficult as it is, and this just makes it more difficult, but that's why they're paying us the big bucks. Sonia.
So I regret missing the week workshop, but I know something is extremely interesting to me. You said more than once this week that the wiring diagrams are finicky. This is my rephrasing, right? It really depends on the one edge being there, not being there. Maybe the graph itself is finicky. Has it come up that maybe other representations would be better? For example, hypergraph, that's the obvious, but something like a K-core decomposition of a graph as opposed to the strongly connected components where you can kick a few edges around without missing the big picture connectedness. I don't know if that has come up. If not, I'm super interested. If yes, I'm super interested. So I don't know if any of the working groups had this discussion.
Well, actually, it has not come up, even though to me it's an extremely important thing because it's part of this translation. It's part of this dictionary of how we translate biology into computational things, and how you do that is all important, right? If you don't do it right, or if you do it in a certain way, it will limit what you can learn, and you have to do it maybe in more than one way to get different aspects. But no, and to me, it's an extremely interesting topic to discuss. So if you're interested,
maybe I'll have to join the group or something.
Well, there was no group on specifically this.
The online thing. I'll just have
Oh, I see. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
There might be something
on the chat.
I'm not sure.
Why don't you give Mr.
Well, I think in my talk, I responded to that question a little bit. So one of the issues we have highlighted is that the connectivity that you see in these models has a lot of redundancy in it. And just and there are mechanisms, we have algorithms to remove a lot of that redundancy that we've been showing affects completely the predictions you make, including from the strongly connected components that predict about what they predict about controllability can be completely wrong because of the redundancy that is present in the underlying structure. And I'd like to highlight maybe something I didn't say in the talk is that the redundancy is not just because they may have been wrongly inferred. The logic itself, even if they were completely correctly inferred, the network effects might render edges that are there pairwise like, but as a whole in the collective become redundant by the presence of others, right? So, but we do have algorithms that do that. Some of them are hypergraph based or threshold network based. We showed a few, but I think it's also important to think the connectivity, the inference of the connectivity can be wrong by a number of reasons. You have to make a lot of decisions, thresholding them, whatever that you put an edge there. So there are also alternatives that are only dynamical. I showed one of those that are only perturbation driven and ignore completely the underlying graph. And they still find modularity, right? I gave the example of if you have, we gave an example of 80 chaotic oscillators connected. Their connectivity is completely random, but they still have modularity. They still have modularity. So I think this vision of just the connectivity is very important to look at connectivity, but there's more to it that comes strictly from the dynamic point of view. And we also for sure have to look at the redundancy that is present in these things because it changes completely the predictions.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So that's I think a really important issue if we think about translating biology into computation. Any other questions or comments?
I'll read a question from the Q&A. How to approach modularity in a simpler way so that differences in data generations across various experiments and organisms don't affect the preserved modular form?
Yeah, wow, that's a complicated. It's an excellent question, but I wouldn't know where to begin. I mean, it's again an issue really of standards, right? There are no standards. People generate data in many different ways, and you know, for their particular purposes. But there's generally no thought about, you know, how these data will be used by other groups or for other purposes. And furthermore, the problem with data, I think, increasingly is that the half-life of data is getting shorter and shorter because new data generation capabilities come along much more quickly, that can generate more data, can generate better data. And so if you have a data set 2 years later, say a transcriptomics data set, very few people might reuse it because they cannot generate new ones. And if you don't have this new technology, then your grant reviewers will say, well, you're just not with it. But it's an excellent question. Thank you.
I had a comment following up Sanjay's question. There is this class of models called like context-dependent probabilistic Boolean networks, where for each variable you have a bunch of functions, and those functions might depend different inputs. So I guess you could generalize this wiring diagram to a hypergraph there.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So the Ilya-Shmulevich probabilistic Boolean networks. Yeah, that would be a more flexible framework for that. Absolutely. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time. If you're part of the workshop, you have 1 more hour to finalize your report and send it to us before you go home. Everybody have a good trip back. Thank you for all the attendees that are not part of the workshop. We appreciate it. This was a very philosophical and very abstract talk. It's probably different from the talks you usually hear in your Friday seminar series. So thanks for indulging me.